I am Dr. Márcio Pereira, a neurosurgeon and neuroscientist, and I dedicate my work to studying how the human brain constructs emotions, bonds, and behavioral patterns that we rarely consciously perceive. Today, I want to talk about something that seems simple at first glance, but which hides one of the deepest conflicts of the human mind: how to activate psychological authority and be respected immediately. When people talk about authority and respect, they often resort to quick, almost automatic explanations, as if they were describing a set of obvious social rules: speaking firmly, maintaining an open body posture, demonstrating confidence, taking up space, not hesitating. This superficial narrative suggests that respect is a direct consequence of visible behaviors, consciously learned and applied as techniques, as if the human brain reacted rationally and predictably to external signals of leadership or security. However, this explanation ignores a fundamental point. Respect is not born from what we deliberately show, but from what the other person perceives, even before formulating a conscious thought. From a neuroscientific point of view, psychological authority is not evaluated by logic, but by ancient automatic brain systems deeply linked to emotional survival. Long before any rational judgment, the other person's brain is already asking silent and decisive questions. Does this person represent a threat or security, unpredictability or stability, risk or protection? These evaluations occur in fractions of a second, mediated by structures such as the amygdala, attachment circuits, and dopaminergic systems that regulate expectation, reward, and social hierarchy. What we call immediate respect is, in fact, the unconscious feeling that someone occupies a psychological position that cannot be easily challenged. The socially accepted version of respect states that it is earned through visible effort, performance, and external validation. Work harder, prove your worth, be useful, be agreeable, and then perhaps you will be respected. The problem is that this logic reverses the real order of mental processes. In the human brain, perceived authority does not arise after approval. It arises beforehand, like a filter that determines whether someone will be listened to, followed, or ignored. People without psychological authority can speak loudly, argue well, and still be disregarded, while others, with few words and minimal exposure, establish almost immediate respect. This difference lies not in superficial charisma, but in the internal relationship each individual maintains with fear, the need for acceptance, and their own emotional self-protection. The human brain detects with uncomfortably precise accuracy subtle signs of emotional dependence, anxiety for validation, and excessive effort to please. These signs activate unconscious circuits in the observer that associate the other with fragility, instability, or subordination, even if this is never verbalized. Thus, disrespect is rarely a conscious choice. It is an automatic response to emotional patterns that escape language. Throughout life, we are conditioned to believe that respect is something that is asked for, earned, or negotiated. Little is said about the psychological cost of this belief. The construction of defensive behaviors, the suppression of internal boundaries, and the repetition of roles of emotional submission disguised as kindness or humility. Society reinforces this. Translated from Portuguese to English, www.online.translator.com. These patterns reward silent obedience and subtly punish those who maintain a firm internal position without asking permission. We thus create a collective illusion of choice, where we believe we are acting freely, when in reality we are reacting to deeply rooted fears of rejection and exclusion. At this point, the inevitable question begins to form, albeit in an uncomfortable way. If respect doesn't stem from what we consciously do, but from what our brain communicates without words, what exactly are we conveying about our psychological state even before opening our mouths? And why do so many people avoid facing this answer? When we talk about psychological authority, it's necessary to abandon the comforting idea that the human brain functions as an impartial judge, consciously evaluating arguments, intentions, and merits. The social brain operates in a much more primitive, automatic, and uncomfortable way. It was shaped in survival contexts, where quickly recognizing who occupied positions of leadership, protection, or threat was a matter of life or death. This mechanism remains active, silent, and dominant, even in modern environments where we pretend to act only based on logic and rational values. Before any conversation develops, the brain is already organizing social space into implicit hierarchies. Who expects approval? Who occupies a neutral position? Who dictates the pace? This interpretation doesn't depend on the content of the speech, but on emotional micro-behaviors that escape conscious control. Response time, how someone maintains silence, the absence of excessive justifications, tolerance for the other person's discomfort. These signals feed specific circuits linked to status perception, especially in the medial prefrontal cortex, which integrates social information, and in the limbic systems, responsible for evaluating security and emotional predictability. The socially accepted explanation usually states that authority comes from knowledge, experience, or formal position. While these factors can reinforce respect, they don't create it from scratch. The human brain doesn't respond to declared authority, but to perceived authority. And perception in this context means internal consistency. When someone needs to over-explain themselves, anticipate potential rejection, or constantly adjust their behavior to avoid conflict, the other person's brain interprets this as a sign of hierarchical instability. This isn't a moral judgment, but an automatic neurobiological reflex. There is a central contradiction in this process. The more a person consciously tries to be respected, the more unconscious signals of insecurity they may emit. The intense desire for acceptance activates social anxiety circuits, increasing internal vigilance and reducing the ability to maintain clear emotional boundaries. The body enters a state of continuous micro-defense, and the observer's brain perceives this state as a lack of authority. Thus, the attempt to control the external image ends up betraying the internal fragility that one tries to hide. Throughout development, we learn to associate belonging with adaptation. Children who perceive that affection depends on pleasing others internalize the idea that emotional security comes from conformity. This conditioning extends into adulthood. Shaping professional, emotional, and social relationships, the result is a repetitive pattern. Highly functional, intelligent, and competent individuals who are nevertheless ignored, interrupted, or disregarded without understanding exactly why. The answer lies not in what they do, but in the psychological place they occupy without realizing it. Society reinforces this mechanism by valuing outwardly expressed behaviors of productivity and likability, while discouraging quiet emotional autonomy. People who don't over-explain, who aren't in a hurry to please, and who tolerate the discomfort of not being immediately accepted, tend to provoke ambiguous reactions, respect mixed with unease. This unease stems from the fact that they don't position themselves as dependent on the judgment of others, breaking a deeply ingrained social expectation. At this point, a new tension begins to form. If psychological authority is perceived as the ability to maintain a stable internal position, even in the face of the risk of rejection, to what extent has the fear of losing connections silently sabotaged how we are treated? And what would happen if we stopped negotiating our emotional position all the time? To understand why psychological authority is as rare as it is desired, it is necessary to observe the central role that fear plays in the organization of human behavior. The brain was not designed to seek respect, it was designed to avoid exclusion. In evolutionary terms, being rejected by the group meant extreme vulnerability. This biological legacy remains active, causing the need for belonging to take priority over the assertion of boundaries, even when this choice generates silent and recurring suffering. The dominant social narrative suggests that respected people are those who are self-assured, independent, and emotionally strong. However, this description ignores the internal conflict that precedes any external display of authority. Most individuals live in constant internal negotiation between the desire to be recognized and the fear of being abandoned. This conflict activates deeply rooted attachment systems, modulated by neurotransmitters such as oxytocin and dopamine, which reinforce approach-seeking and approval-seeking behaviors. The problem arises when these systems begin to govern decisions that should be regulated by emotional autonomy. When someone conditions their own self-worth on the response of another, the brain enters a state of continuous vigilance. Every interaction becomes an implicit evaluation of acceptance or rejection. Small signals, a delay in response, a change in tone, a prolonged silence, are interpreted as potential threats. This state of alert consumes cognitive resources and weakens the ability to maintain a firm internal position. The individual begins to yield even before being confronted, adjusting behaviors to minimize emotional risks that often do not even objectively exist. From an observer's point of view, these adjustments do not go unnoticed. The human brain is highly sensitive to signals of excessive self-protection. When someone anticipates, justifies, or withdraws to avoid discomfort, they non-verbally convey the message that they are emotionally dependent on the approval of others. On the one hand, there is active dependency. On the other, hierarchical circuits that position the individual in an inferior psychological place, even if no words are spoken to that effect. The disrespect that emerges from this is not necessarily hostile. It is structural, almost automatic. There is a profound contradiction in this mechanism. The more a person tries to preserve bonds at any cost, the more they weaken their own position within them. Excessive attachment weakens internal authority because it shifts the individual's security axis outside of themselves. The brain, upon perceiving this dependence, begins to operate under the logic of emotional scarcity, where each interaction carries a disproportionate weight. This pattern repeats itself in effective relationships, work environments, and even family dynamics, creating predictable cycles of frustration and invisibility. Society, in turn, reinforces this pattern by romanticizing constant availability and unrestricted adaptation. We confuse empathy with self-annihilation and call emotional maturity what is often just well-disguised fear. Little is said about the cumulative cost of this posture. Internal wear and tear, loss of clarity about one's own limits, and the construction of an identity based on avoiding conflict, not on upholding positions. This cost does not appear immediately, but manifests itself over time in the form of silent resentment and a persistent feeling of devaluation. Given this, a question arises that tends to be avoided, but which is becoming increasingly important. If the fear of losing the other person leads us to relinquish our own psychological authority, to what extent are we truly preserving bonds or merely postponing in a more painful way the experience of disrespect? There is a deeply ingrained misconception in how we understand self-protection. Socially, we have learned to associate it with rigidity, detachment, or emotional coldness, as if protecting one's own psychic integrity meant erecting visible walls or adopting explicit defensive postures. From a neuroscientific point of view, however, the most effective self-protection is silent, almost imperceptible, and is directly linked to the ability to maintain stable internal states in the face of uncertainty and the reaction of others. Psychological authority begins to form when the brain stops operating in reactive mode. Individuals who live anticipating responses, adjusting their speech, and constantly monitoring the emotional impact they have on others remain trapped in threat circuits. The amygdala remains active, signaling danger where it often doesn't exist, while the prefrontal cortex loses efficiency in regulating impulses and maintaining boundaries. The result is behavior that appears socially functional, but subtly conveys a constant willingness to compromise. The observer's brain perceives this disposition even before any boundaries are tested. When someone demonstrates excessive tolerance for intrusion, for the emotional disorganization of others, or for relational ambiguity, they unconsciously communicate that they are available to absorb tensions that do not belong to them. This availability, although frequently confused with maturity or empathy, is interpreted by the social system as an absence of clear boundaries. Where there are no perceived boundaries, there is no need for active respect. In contrast, people who maintain emotional self-protection don't need to explicitly assert authority. They don't threaten, impose, or compete for space. What they do, almost invisibly, is remain internally unmoved by external pressures. The brains of these individuals operate in a state of lower reactivity, with greater integration between limbic and prefrontal areas, allowing silence, pauses, and the absence of immediate response to function as signals of stability. These signals are interpreted as emotional predictability, one of the most important pillars of psychological authority. However, there is an initial psychological cost to this process. Maintaining self-protection implies accepting the discomfort of not being immediately understood, validated, or approved. For brains conditioned to the constant search for acceptance, this discomfort activates old fears of rejection. It is precisely at this point that many retreat, confusing transient anxiety with real danger. Society reinforces this confusion by associating harmony with the absence of tension, ignoring that every hierarchical reorganization inevitably generates some level of relational discomfort. Over time, this inability to tolerate discomfort crystallizes into predictable patterns. The person learns that giving in is quicker than maintaining boundaries, that explaining is safer than remaining silent, that adapting is less risky than standing firm. Each of these choices seems small, almost irrelevant in isolation, but together they build a psychological identity that the other person's brain comes to recognize as malleable. And where there is excessive malleability, authority dissolves before it is even tested. At this stage of the analysis, a new tension inevitably arises. If psychological authority is not built through external affirmation, but through the internal capacity to not react automatically to fear, how many of our daily attitudes are, in fact, unconscious attempts to avoid discomfort that we have never learned to tolerate? And what has this cost us in terms of how we are treated throughout our lives? As these patterns repeat themselves, the individual comes to believe they are making free choices, when in reality, they are merely responding to deeply ingrained conditioning. Modern society reinforces the idea of autonomy by offering a multitude of apparent options: career choices, lifestyle choices, relationship choices, while maintaining intact the same emotional control mechanisms based on fear, scarcity, and constant comparison. The result is a diffuse sense of freedom, accompanied by a recurring experience of silent disrespect. The human brain is highly susceptible to implicit norms. We learn early on that disagreeing generates tension, that remaining silent can be interpreted as hostility, and that occupying emotional space can provoke rejection. These associations are reinforced by subtle social rewards: approval, inclusion, momentary relief from anxiety. Every time an individual adapts to avoid friction, the dopaminergic system registers the experience as a success, strengthening the behavior. The problem is that this reward is short-term, while the structural consequence, the erosion of psychological authority, accumulates slowly, almost imperceptibly. Over time, a perplexing paradox develops. The person feels increasingly emotionally exhausted, but cannot identify the source of this fatigue. She meets expectations, maintains relationships, participates in social interactions, and yet still experiences the persistent feeling of not being fully valued. This strain doesn't stem from explicit conflicts, but from their absence. The brain, deprived of the opportunity to uphold boundaries and reorganize hierarchies, remains in a state of continuous adaptation, which consumes psychic energy and reduces the perception of internal control. The dominant cultural narrative suggests that respect is a consequence of continuous effort and constant goodwill. There is little discussion about the role of emotional scarcity in this dynamic. When someone is always available, always understanding, always adaptable, the other person's brain ceases to value their presence, not out of conscious malice, but because value systems and hierarchy are regulated by the perception of limits and cost. That which does not require emotional effort to maintain tends to be taken for granted. This logic manifests itself particularly clearly in environments where competition is veiled, such as professional relationships and long-term emotional bonds. The person who avoids conflict to preserve the atmosphere ends up becoming the point of absorption for others' tensions. Gradually, their psychological role becomes fixed. They are heard but not considered, consulted but not followed, present but not central. The respect that seemed to be being built never materializes because the collective brain has already positioned them in a functional but subordinate place. At this point, the illusion reveals itself in an uncomfortable way. The perceived freedom to choose, to please, to adapt is nothing more than a learned emotional survival strategy. The individual does not act from autonomy, but from conditioning. And as long as this pattern is not recognized, any attempt to activate authority through superficial techniques tends to fail because the other person's brain continues to respond to the internal position that remains unchanged. The tension that emerges here is difficult to ignore. If disrespect is not an isolated event, but the cumulative result of small, unconscious adaptations reinforced socially, to what extent is our feeling of being in control of our own lives nothing more than a fragile construct? And what would happen if that control needed to be exercised precisely where we have learned to yield without realizing it? There is a moment, almost always silent, when the brain begins to perceive the incoherence between the image it holds and the way it is treated. It's not a dramatic event, but an accumulation of micro-experiences, recurring interruptions, ignored decisions, limits tested without consequence. This breaking point is not marked by an emotional explosion, but by a strange, uncomfortable clarity. The individual realizes that the problem is not a lack of effort, but the psychological place they have occupied for a long time without questioning it. From this understanding, it becomes evident that psychological authority cannot be built as a performance. It emerges when there is alignment between internal state and external behavior. The human brain responds to coherence, not intensity. When someone stops reacting automatically to the fear of losing ground, something fundamental is reorganized. Threat systems reduce their activity, the prefrontal cortex recovers its regulatory capacity, and behavior becomes guided. Less out of anxious self-protection and more out of internal stability. This change, though subtle, is immediately perceived by the other person's brain. The respect that arises from this state is neither asked for nor negotiated. It happens because the individual stops sending signals of emotional dependence. Silences cease to be filled with justifications, decisions cease to be over-explained, limits cease to be announced, and are instead sustained by the absence of internal movement in the face of pressure. This type of authority is not imposed, it is established by contrast. In an environment where the majority reacts, those who do not react redefine the rhythm. However, this process is not without consequences. By maintaining a firm internal position, the individual inevitably exposes weaknesses in the bonds that depended on their constant adaptation. Some relationships reorganize, others drift apart. This distancing is often interpreted as loss, when in fact it reveals the conditional nature of certain respects. The human brain resists this transition because it challenges the association between belonging and emotional submission learned throughout life. Society rarely prepares people to deal with this stage. We talk about self-esteem, self-confidence, and assertiveness, but we avoid discussing the psychological grief that accompanies the loss of old roles. Abandoning the position of always giving in implies accepting that not every relationship will survive the presence of limits. This acceptance requires emotional maturity and tolerance for discomfort, two capacities that are rarely cultivated in a culture that values quick approval and superficial harmony. At the end of this investigation, there is no comfortable conclusion, only a disturbing realization. The psychological authority that generates immediate respect is not something that is activated, but something that ceases to be sabotaged. It is not born from techniques, but from the interruption of automatic patterns of fear and adaptation. And the question that remains, without a definitive answer, is this: if respect arises when we stop silently negotiating our internal position, what exactly are we willing to lose to finally occupy the psychological place we have always avoided sustaining?